Another day, another story. Without Squanto, aka Tisquantum, to interpret and guide them to food sources, the Plymouth colony Pilgrims may have never have survived. Squanto, also known as Tisquantum, was a Native American of the Patuxet tribe who played a crucial role in the early interactions between Native Americans and English settlers in what is now New England. His role in the first Thanksgiving is significant. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. Squanto's early life was marked by a series of events that led him to have contact with English settlers. In 1605, he was captured by an English explorer named George Weymouth and taken to England. There, he learned the English language and culture. In 1619, Squanto returned to North America, only to find that his tribe, the Patuxet, had been wiped out by diseases brought by European explorers and traders. In 1620, the Pilgrims, a group of English separatists, arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, on the Mayflower. They faced harsh conditions and struggled to survive. Squanto, who had been living with the Wampanoag tribe, played a crucial role in helping the Pilgrims establish relations with the Wampanoag people, led by Chief Massasoit. Squanto served as an interpreter and mediator between the English settlers and the Native Americans. He taught the Pilgrims important survival skills, such as how to plant corn, where and how to fish, and how to fertilize the soil. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated a successful harvest, and it is often referred to as the First Thanksgiving. The event was a three-day feast that included both Pilgrims and Wampanoag people. Squanto helped facilitate this peaceful gathering by assisting with negotiations and translation. The feast was a symbol of goodwill and cooperation between the two groups and is seen as one of the early instances of cultural exchange between Native Americans and European settlers. Squanto's assistance was instrumental in the survival of the Plymouth colony in its early years, and his role in the first Thanksgiving is remembered as a symbol of cooperation and peaceful coexistence between different cultures, even though the relationship between Native Americans and European settlers would become much more complex in the years that followed. After the successful first Thanksgiving in 1621, Squanto continued to play a vital role in maintaining peaceful relations between the Plymouth colony and the Wampanoag tribe. Over the next few years, he acted as a mediator in various disputes that arose between the two groups. One significant event took place in 1623 when a severe drought threatened the Pilgrims' crops. With their survival at stake, they turned to Squanto for help. He taught them innovative agricultural techniques, including a method known as Three Sisters planting. This method involved planting corn, beans, and squash together in the same mound, which helped each crop support and nourish the others. Squanto's guidance not only saved the Pilgrims from famine but also improved their long-term agricultural practices. Squanto's expertise and diplomacy extended beyond the realm of agriculture. He helped negotiate treaties and alliances between the Pilgrims and other Native American tribes, strengthening the Plymouth colony's position in the region. Unfortunately, Squanto's story takes a tragic turn in 1622 when he fell seriously ill and passed away. His death was a great loss to both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people, as he had played a crucial role in bridging the gap between their cultures. In his honor, the Pilgrims and Wampanoag people continued to celebrate moments of cooperation and unity with feasts, emphasizing the importance of Squanto's contributions in fostering goodwill between two communities with vastly different backgrounds. Squanto's legacy endures as a symbol of the potential for understanding and cooperation between different cultures, even in challenging times. For generations, the dominant cultural narrative of America's Thanksgiving holiday has told how a Native American man named Squanto showed the Pilgrims how to get food after they arrived on the Mayflower in Massachusetts in 1620. Having fled their native England, the new émigrés endured hardship and privation in both their journey and their adjustment to the new land. Those who survived in the early settlement are said to have gathered with the native people in a feast of gratitude, establishing the time-honored tradition of having a Thanksgiving dinner on the fourth Thursday of November. The historical details of this somewhat mythologized story are far more complicated, as was the life of Squanto, whose actual name was Tisquantum. He and his indigenous relatives would have been quite familiar with the tradition of Thanksgiving, because it was, and still is, an essential aspect of their regular spiritual practices, one that predates by many generations the American holiday of Thanksgiving. A member of the Patuxet tribe of the Wampanoags, Squanto was likely born around 1580. When he encountered the Plymouth colony settlers, he spoke English, having lived 5 years in Europe, including time at the home of a London merchant. He proved indispensable to the English settlers at Plymouth, but in the end was reviled by some of his own people for his role in brokering a treaty that undermined tribal sovereignty. But without Squanto to interpret and guide them to food sources, the Plymouth colony Pilgrims may never have survived. His is such a seminal backstory to Plymouth, historic spelling, colony that the lack of historical reference to it is conspicuous, writes Paula Peters, a journalist and member of the Mashpee Wampanoag, in an essay about Squanto, the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims for the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. His name remains ubiquitous in Thanksgiving stories, but little is known of his life, family and tribulations prior to encountering the Plymouth colony settlers. Squanto spoke English after being kidnapped to Europe. The Wampanoag, whose name means people of the first light, and their ancestors had lived in Patuxet for at least 10,000 years. They hunted, fished and farmed corn, beans and squash when encountered for the first time by Europeans. Their non-hierarchical system of governance and nature-based spirituality bewildered the new settlers. By 1619, the Wampanoag survived a devastating plague brought by European explorers called the Great Dying. The disease killed about 2/3 of their 70,000 people who had been living in 69 villages along what is now the southern Massachusetts coast. So sudden and overwhelming was the sickness, that when the Mayflower landed, its passengers had to stride across the bleached bones of plague victims, writes Peters. Some of the colonists described the Great Dying as a providential act of God that made way for a flourishing of their Puritan faith. Squanto escaped this scourge because, years earlier, he had been lured, along with about 24 other Wampanoag, onto a British ship bound for a slave market in Spain. According to James Seeley Jr. and Sean Selby, historians at Kent State University and authors of Shaping North America, From Exploration to the American Revolution. He escaped with the help of Catholic friars and made his way to London, where he lived with John Slaney, treasurer of the Newfoundland Company, which had colonized Cooper's Cove in Newfoundland in 1610. Squanto likely used this connection to depart England for home, working on a ship for Captain John Mason, the Newfoundland colony's governor. He then found passage on another ship that brought him south, where he eventually made his way back to Patuxet. Squanto was among 2 to 5.5 million indigenous people enslaved in the Americas between 1492 and 1880, many of whom were sent to work in the Caribbean. According to Wampanoag historian Linda Jeffers Coombs, Squanto was one of only 2 tribal members who found his way back home from the slave ship that landed in Spain. Pilgrims likely didn't invite native people to their first harvest Thanksgiving. On his return, Squanto was distraught to find his people decimated by plague. When he encountered the Mayflower's ragged survivors, he was an orphan himself. But he was uniquely poised to help them survive, and willing to help them form a vital alliance with his Wampanoag leader, named Alsamakin. Squanto favored the English enough to teach them how to grow corn, and where and how to fish and hunt beaver. He also gained protection from the English at times from his own people. The treaty he helped negotiate between his people and the English allowed the Wampanoag to gain a powerful ally against their enemy, the Narragansett. But it also empowered the English with the dominant rule of law, while restricting the Wampanoag's use and display of weapons at meetings. This treaty led to subjugation, and Squanto died while allied with the English, perhaps even poisoned by his own people in late 1622, writes historian Nathaniel Philbrick in his book Mayflower, A Story of Courage, Community and War. It's likely the Pilgrims didn't actually invite the Wampanoag to the first harvest, Thanksgiving, memorialized in the now popular American holiday. In fact, the tense days-long feast convened to put at ease some 90 Wampanoag warriors who had arrived at Plymouth fully armed in response to a volley of celebratory gunfire they had heard shot by the colonists. Historical sources state that, once they realized the gunfire wasn't intended as hostile, the Wampanoags killed 5 deer and brought them to Plymouth as their contribution to what has been described as a harvest feast, and perhaps a celebration of survival for making it through their second winter. If you're getting ready to eat, we will bring food for you. That's who we are as people, says Anita Peters, known as Mother Bear, a Mashpee Wampanoag tribal member. But that feast was never repeated, and that should tell you something. Nakai Clearwater Northup, museum educator at Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, says the Thanksgiving holiday likely conflates several feasts held during the time period, including the Pilgrims' celebration of their victory in the Mystic Massacre of 1637, in which 600 Pequots lost their lives in about an hour. This was the primary tragic moment in our history, Northup said. It laid the foundation for colonialism, and the first reservation was created right here in Connecticut. This laid the blueprint for the rest of our native relatives for generations to come. Indigenous religions, which have long included the ubiquitous ceremonies of giving thanks for many food sources throughout the year, would be suppressed by the dominant culture of Christianity. Yet the spiritual practices of reciprocity and thanksgiving for the gifts of the earth survive among the Wampanoag and many other indigenous nations to this day. When I was young, we were taught by our grandparents and great-grandparents to believe that the purpose of life is to be in a state of thanksgiving every day, says Mother Bear. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.